Hi, my name is Juan, and welcome to The Couch, a podcast where real therapists talk about real things. Please remember that we are therapists, but we are not your therapists, and this podcast is intended for educational purposes only. Now, my friends, we always have to start with that intro just for liability purposes, of course. Now, typically on the podcast, it'd be myself and JC or an interview with another awesome individual in the community. What we're going to do, though, is we're going to talk about a really important topic, and it really is going to pertain to parents of young kids, parents of middle schoolers. Ooh, those middle school years, right, where your child's trying to figure out who they are, wandering through the hallway. What's my locker code? At least that was me back in the day in middle school, trying to remember what is the code to this locker so I can get my things. I'm focused on parents of high schoolers. So the goal for today's podcast episode is to help you parents. And if you have a child, bring them in, let them listen to this episode. Is to help parents, help kids talk about really important areas that can, in a way, boost, enhance, improve your child's mental health. And I thought a really neat place to start was the CDC with a focus on mental health. And I'm going to pull out some really important things. But, instead of starting with a negative of here's the rates of anxiety or here's the rates of depression or ADHD, I was on the site and I'm just going to read it verbatim. Indicators of positive mental health present in children, right? So when I share this with you, here's what I want you to look at. You have your child, and overall you want them to have a successful life. Now you get to decide what that term success means. I'm a mental health counselor. I'm a father. I've got 2 kids. I'm a husband, owner of Santos Counseling. I love seeing families come into the practice, seeing kids walk in excited, hopefully excited to see their therapist, to see their counselor. I also like to see parents feel supported during that process. I don't know about you, but becoming a parent, it's a mixture of hoping for the best, making some good guesses, and just doing your best along the way. So the indicators of positive mental health present in children: affection, right? And what does that mean? That means provide your child affection. Resilience. Give them a space where they can really cultivate that. Positivity. Give them a space where they can engage in positive actions, acts of kindness, gratitude. Give them a space of curiosity, right? Curiosity where they can learn and grow, and you can really foster that environment for them. Give them a space of self-control. Self-control is where they get to work on figuring out these big emotions. And a big emotion, it's not just that we as adults, figure it all of a sudden. Kids are learning at 5 years old what a big emotion of anger is and how to manage it in kindergarten or a preschool classroom. And just like that, a middle schooler, 8th grader, is trying to figure out that big emotion of insecurity. And just like that, a 12th grader, right, about to go to college or join the workforce or take a leap year, they're trying to figure out that big emotion of, is this the right decision, right? So if you notice, all across the spectrum, there's so much support we can give our kids. And what I want to encourage you to start with is look at these positive indicators that lead to kids finding success when it comes to improving their mental health. And here's what some of them are. The home environment, fill it with affection. Create a space of resilience. Have a positive atmosphere. Have a place of curiosity, where you're fostering growth. Have a space where there's control. Control in the manner of self-regulation, right? Your child learning, this is how I handle some of these big feelings. And your kids have the example in front of them, which is why I'm a huge advocate of myself working with a counselor. And I encourage parents in general, Whether you work with a counselor or engage in a self-help book, do some sort of improvement, because what's going to happen is your child's going to see that. Or they're going to look at you, and you may not even know they're looking in your direction, but they're listening, they're observing verbal, nonverbal cues. And when they see that you're doing the work, when they see that you're practicing self-regulation, they see that when you're practicing curiosity, when you're practicing persistence, when you're practicing resilience, when you're practicing affection, right? What's going to happen? Well, the mirror effect's going to happen, right? They're going to look at you and they're going to go, wow. They may not say it, right? Our kids may not say, well, thanks, Mom, thanks, Dad. You really showed some really great affection there, and that's going to lead the way for me. That'd be nice, but they often don't say that. The next place I want to jump to, and again, this is really looking at how do we cultivate a space for our kids, all the way from young toddlers and forth through the elementary, middle school, and high school years, so that, and some of these you can use even beyond that point, so that they're able to have have success when it comes to their mental health. Couple of facts when it goes into mental health for children in the U.S. ADHD, behavioral challenges, depression, anxiety, right? These are some of the most common diagnoses. And this is pulled from 2016 to 2019 between age from 17 years all the way down to 3 years. So when we look at that, you got ADHD, attention deficit hyperactive disorder. You've got anxiety, which can really broaden, right, all the way from a social anxiety. It could just be that they're feeling overly worried. It could be behavioral challenges. Maybe your child is in, their first year of kindergarten, and they're away from that preschool, small classroom setting. So now they're having a hard time sitting still, and perhaps that difficulty in sitting still leads to a sense of frustration, agitation, and they're acting out, right? But we know that inside something else is going on, right? Maybe they're just struggling with that transition, that change. It could be your middle schooler. Maybe they're having a hard time show up to the classroom. Maybe they're having a hard time listening to the direction of instructors. So then they are resistant to that. And conduct comes in, whether skipping class or not wanting to go to class, not turning in assignments, talking back, right? That whole big area there of behavioral problems. And in the mental health world, we look at that as oppositional defiant disorder. But often what I really like to do, with especially the counselors here at Santos Counseling, is I encourage them to use the iceberg effect. And here's what that is. And I love having this podcast because it gives you an inside view of the practice Santos Counseling. What we want to do is we want to extend beyond just graduate school training. So when counselors come in, there is that graduate school training, right? They have a master's level or a doctorate level. And from that point, we look at what's next. And that's where additional training comes in. So something that we look at, and I'll share this example so it makes sense to you, is if a child comes in with, let's say, oppositional defiant disorder, where they're just having some behavioral challenges, maybe talking back, maybe disrespectful, maybe skipping class, not being compliant, if you will, with parents, with authority, and so forth. We train of let's look at this from an iceberg effect, meaning that, imagine you're out in the water and you see the tip of the iceberg. Well, that's the tip that we're seeing. And then what we look at is what is below the water, right? Because more than likely below the water is maybe something else. Maybe there's trauma. Maybe there's insecurity. Maybe there's I'm frustrated sitting here all day. Maybe there is I feel alone and I'm having a hard time making friends, right? No one's listening to me. Maybe there is I want to participate in the class, but I don't understand what's happening, and that makes me really upset. And the only way that I can show that is through defiance, through resistance, through putting a barrier between myself and others. And the counselors within Santos Counseling, we engage in additional trainings. We look at play therapy. We dig into trauma-informed therapy. And we look at DBT, CBT. We look at all of these areas. And the key reason why is because there's always more to learn, right? And the more that we can learn, the more structured and the more effective we can show up for those that we serve. The next one on here that kids between that 3 to 17 may struggle with is depression, right? And all of these, anxiety, ADHD, depression, behavior problems, it's not always very black and white. It may not be that your child is having thoughts of harming themselves, right? It could be that they're laying back a little bit. Maybe they're not wanting to hang out with other peers in the classroom. Maybe they're wanting to, just be on their own. And that, right, that's like a manifestation. It's a way that depression can show up. So I wanted to share those items with you. And the last one before we go into what we can start doing is when you notice any one of these, keep in mind that they can co-occur with others. So let me share an example here from the same, looking at the literature from the CDC. And it's the same age group, 3 to 17. So having another mental health disorder, right? The ones that mentioned ADHD, anxiety, behavior problems, depression, that increases the likelihood that there's another one going to come with it. And then here, one example this share is for children with anxiety, right? It's more than 1 in 3 also has some sort of behavioral challenge. And 1 in 3 had some sort of depression-related difficulty. And for us as parents, it's really important because we want to look at not only why, but how do we stop the cycle? So that's where, as you're developing and growing as a parent, and I think parent is a journey, right? It is parenthood, and it's this long marathon all the way, right? And you're going through these valleys where versus, putting wall outlet protectors and soft little corner, I forget what those things are, but you put them all over your house so that your young, delicate toddler is not getting hurt, right? They're not going in places they shouldn't go. And that's part of that journey of parenting. And before you know it, they are on their own, right? And you're like, hey, you want to hang out with me? And they're like, no, I'm hanging out with my friends. And that's another stepping stone in parenthood. And then comes, these points where I work with high school parents. And it's, my kid's just kind of branching off, not wanting to spend too much time with me. So it's looking at that, that phase, right? And it's chapters in a book. And each one presents a little bit of a different story. So with it, as parents, we have to look at our mythology. How are we showing up? So I wanted to start this episode here on the podcast when we look at parenting with some data to put in front of you. So overall, let's just quickly review it. When we look at what can we start doing, right, to promote success in the area of mental health, we can start creating a home environment that is open to curiosity. Right? Let your child grow. Let them figure out who their authentic self is versus saying this is exactly who you're going to be. Right? You put someone in a cage and they're likely not going to like that. Persistence. Teaching them persistence, teaching them resilience, cultivating, fostering a space of positivity, of affection. Right? Looking at educating and modeling self-regulation. Those are key areas there that you can go ahead and start working on. Or, speak more with your counselor on. The other areas of mental health disorders in children, as far as what the statistics are saying, is kids between that 3 to 17, right? 2016 to 2019 data here. ADHD, anxiety, behavioral problems, depression. But those I want you to look at as, right, that's just one term. They can expand. So anxiety is not just a person has anxiety. It could be problems focusing and concentrating, worry. So it grows and expands into more and more ways that it can show up. That's what I mean by that, with more and more ways. So here, let's look at ways that we can support our kids. And what I want to do is I want to go over, for this episode, two important ones. And as you dive into this episode, any other episode of the podcast, it's okay to bridge this into your therapy session. Let your counselor know, hey, I was on the Couch podcast and I heard blank episode and they talked a little bit about this. I want to talk to you about it. And maybe the counselor's like, yeah, I just heard it too, or no, I haven't heard that one. Which one is it? And then they listen to it. And then now you build some conversation around it, some dialogue around it. So the first area that I want you to look at when it comes to showing up as a parent and promoting and fostering an environment where your child can have a really beautiful definition of success when it comes to their mental health is mental health friendly language, right? So I'll give you an example of what not to do, if you will, right? So it's growing up in a house and you've got your 12-year-old and your 12-year-old says, hey, mom, dad, listen, oh, I'm just really struggling. I'm having a hard time. I don't understand what's happening in the classroom, and it's getting annoying. And all I want to do is, lay in bed. And the parent says, well, you stop being lazy, step up to the plate and do the work. Right? It's not the most friendly language. Right? Because we may say that to our child because we want to motivate them and give them that David Goggins, really hard talk. And the issue is that there's a gap that needs to be filled. There's a hole that needs to be filled first. Right? And the hole that needs to be filled first is this space of affection, curiosity, understanding. Right? So that's taking a step back and being curious as a parent. And then teaching your child to be curious too about what's going on. So it could be, let's say the kid's name Bob. It could be Bob. Well, first off, thanks for coming to me and talking to me about this. Let's sit down or let's go for a walk. And the reason I bring up just between, you and I in this podcast, a walk or sitting down, is it slows things down. When you walk, you've got these beautiful, right, hormones coming out. And when you sit down, you get to practice mindfulness within that process. Really, both of them practice that sense of mindfulness. So then you may go, Bob, what's happening? And then your child starts to talk a little bit more about what's taking place. And there, what you're doing is you're learning. Your child is teaching you what's happening versus, you come up with that solution while not fully understanding that space. When speaking with your child, ensure to focus on them as a person and not the mental health issue. Right? So that's an important facet there when it comes to mental health friendly language. And I want you to think about that. Think about whenever you communicate with your child on a mental health difficulty. Are you speaking to them as a person, as a human being, versus the mental health issue? Try to use language that's easy to understand given their age. So here, when you communicate with an 8-year-old versus a 17-year-old, keep that in mind. And this sometimes I notice is challenging with parents when kids are at different ages. Like mine as an example, I have a 10-year-old and an 8-year-old. And my 10-year-old, she's been around a good amount longer. And there's times that I'll have to really catch myself, and I don't get it perfect. There's times that I'll communicate with my 8-year-old with the same expectation as my 10-year-old. But then I have to remind myself, shit, my 10-year-old's had, 2 more years of dealing with me, of hanging out with me. And that's where, as parents, we really have to be self-aware. Next one on here with mental health friendly language, always focus on your child's strengths instead of starting with the issue or the problem. And then I just want you to think about that in general. That's such a gentle and supportive and kind and compassionate way to communicate with any human being. Let me start with your strengths. Versus that kid comes in and then, you tell them, well, you're lazy and this is why your grades are down because you never show up because you're not doing enough. Right? What if I just scratch all of that? Because the end goal is the same goal. The end goal is that you want to help your child. So if the end goal stays consistent, that you want to help your child, then that's where you can shift that language. Instead of starting with what I shared earlier, it could start with, well, you know what? Big props to you for coming and bringing this to the table. It takes a lot of strength. It takes a lot of courage to talk about, hey, I need a little bit of support. I think that's awesome. I'm really proud of you. Right? You're highlighting a strength because they're being vulnerable. Vulnerability is a strength. As a side note, dig into Brene Brown. She's got some really good YouTube videos on vulnerability. Let's see. The next one I want to go over here is supporting your child, right? So we're looking at ways to show up, ways to help your child. And this one goes a lot into leadership. Model positive coping skills for kids. So here, what you're wanting to think about is your child more than likely goes through a lot of the same things that you go through. They go through moments of insecurity, moments of doubt, moments where they don't feel like they're good enough, moments where they feel like they're guessing and they're hoping it works out, moments where they feel alone, moments where they feel brave and strong and they feel really secure. So having you practice and model a lot of these coping skills can be really effective. And let me just lay out a really simple example for you. Let's say that I'm at work and I work in a corporate setting. I could come home and share with my child. I could say, hey, I want to tell you a story about what happened at work today. I had this situation where I needed to get something off my chest because I felt that my boss wasn't really hearing me. And I noticed that the more I didn't talk about it, the more frustrated I got. and the more agitated I got. So you know what I did? And the kid says, well, what'd you do? I was like, well, I went to my boss and I said, hey, is it okay if you and I have a private conversation today at the end of the day? And my boss said yes. And before that conversation, I wrote down some notes of what I wanted to talk about. I practiced it in my head. And then I went in there and I shared what I wanted to tell my boss. And it went really well. Right? So I laid this entire story out for my child so they can get a lot of practice. Number one, they can understand the importance of not holding things in. I could even throw in like a little curveball in there and say, what do you think would have happened if I would have not said anything, if I would have just held this in? And, my child may go, well, if you hold it in, then that could, explode, right? And then you're like, yeah, that could have happened. Or I could ask my child for feedback. Say, well, what would you have done in that situation? And overall, what I'm doing is I'm practicing a lot of therapeutic skills on there with my child. I'm doing some visualization. I'm doing some modeling. I'm inviting them in the process. The process is mindful, right? So that's one example there of parents modeling healthy coping skills, self-regulation, so that your child is able to see it. They're able to talk to you about it. And then tomorrow, we know that our kids are going to go through challenging moments. Right? No matter how many protective cushions we put in their life, they're bound to go through one or two at minimum challenging moments. So that's where providing that guidance early on, providing that modeling early on can be really helpful. Now, as we finish off today's episode, I want to share with you gratitude for listening to the couch. This is a really important mission behind the practice of Santos counseling, looking at how can we as a practice say thank you to the Greensboro and surrounding community. There's just so much gratitude. The practice started in 2014. Right now it's 2024 at the moment that I'm recording this. So it's a decade of serving the Greensboro community, being really well connected with so many schools here, elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, so many attorney offices, so many pediatric offices, and primary care offices. And just it's such a beautiful thing to see this revolving door, if you will. A revolving door meaning that we as a practice just show up as much as we can to support the Greensboro community. And then from the other end, just so grateful that Greensboro continues to show up and trust, right? Trust us as a provider to be able to walk with you, right? Walk with you in your mental health journey. And as a practice, we serve many individuals. We work with couples. We work with adults. We work with college students. We work with kids, right? This episode's all about kids. Kids all the way from young 5-year-olds who are just getting those first heavy steps in pre-K and kindergarten, all the way up through the high school and college years and so forth. We work through grief, supporting individuals in that grief process. We are thankful, right? And I can't tell you how much, really, just beyond words, thankful. Seeing the practice grow in this way and have this connection with the community. If you've sat down with me years ago, this would have been beyond the vision. As an immigrant kid myself, coming from the Dominican Republic to the U.S., I and my family received a lot of help from the community. And I don't know if I ever told this story, but there's one that sticks with me till today. It makes me want to cry every time I talk about it. We had one of our first Christmases in the U.S. And I've got a lot of siblings, up there in numbers. So it was, of course, it must have been challenging for my parents to buy us all the Christmas presents we wanted. And we had, I believe it was a donation through a local YMCA. That's what I'm remembering. But we had all these brand new bikes, right? And that's the definition of community, right? Showing up. And it's always stuck out with me because, I don't know who those individuals were. But to this day, my family participates in those type of things. Like we show up for other individuals and donate here or do a wish list there, because I know that I know what it did for me at that age, and I want every other child to feel that same way, and I want families to feel that same way. It's important for me to share that so that you're able to see Santos counseling as a counseling practice of, different clinicians of different breeds and different types. Some of us, like me, aren't so tall, but we got some others that are taller, and we're just a little bit different. But that's okay. We're beautiful in our own way, and I think it helps listeners get to know us a little bit more, get to know that story behind the brand, behind the practice, behind why we show up. So I'll leave you with a thank you. And if you feel that any of these episodes are helpful to any degree, and you got somebody in your life that needs a little nudge, a little bit of a hug, share it with them. Send them a link. If you ever have any ideas on episodes you would like to listen to, let us know. Wherever you're listening at, there's a little comment section. Leave a review. Let us know what you think of the episode, and then put a little note on there. Hey, like an episode on this. All right. I'll see you in the next episode.